is the 2014 Infiniti Q60s, otherwise known as the G37s. With a 330 horsepower, naturally aspirated 3.7 liter V6 mated to a 6-speed manual transmission, this is undoubtedly a relic of the past, a car that we just don't see anymore. We're in the perfect place to test drive a rear-wheel drive front-engine coupe like the Infiniti G37s. I'm Alex, your host, and join me for Test Drive Infiniti Q60s. For this test drive, we set out to answer one question. Considering we just test drove the excellent 2014 Audi S4, a direct competitor to this vehicle and a car that we called one of the most underrated daily drivers out there, can the 2014 Infiniti Q60s keep up or even deliver a better experience than the same model year S4? So at the very top here, let's get on the same page about what this car is. This is the 2014 Infiniti Q60s. That's what it says on the back badges, that's what it says on the registration paperwork, and that's what it said on the window sticker when this car was first bought. But you wouldn't be blamed for thinking this is the Infiniti G37s. After all, it is. From 2007 to 2013, this vehicle, part for part, was called the Infiniti G37s. In 2014 and 15, without changing anything mechanically or changing anything even like a bumper part, they renamed this from the G37s to the Q60s. And we'll get into more of that later. But whether you want to refer to this as the Infiniti Q60s or the G37s, you're right. And we're going to refer to them interchangeably during the course of this conversation. Underneath the hood of the G37 is a 3.7 liter naturally aspirated V6 putting out 330 horsepower and 270 pound-feet of torque. The engine underneath the hood of the Infiniti G37 is good for getting it 0 to 60 in 5.4 seconds. The quarter mile will fly by in 13.9. Top speed is limited at 155 miles an hour. When I think of competitors for the G37s of this era, it's definitely the Audi S4, which we just test drove, the Mercedes C350, BMW 335i, the Lexus IS350. But when you look at all of those, all of them, except for the Audi, trail in horsepower to this Infiniti's naturally aspirated 3.7. And as a matter of fact, the S4 only leads this by 3 horsepower, and it has the advantage of being supercharged. So it's one hell of a V6. I'm curious what folks think about the exhaust notes on the G series. Ever since the G35 first debuted up until now, for the naturally aspirated VQ engines, it's had a very distinct exhaust note, kind of a tingy sound. Sounds, in my opinion, I think like a really good exhaust stock. But I will say, and we've all heard them, a lot of aftermarket exhausts for this car and engine setup sound god awful. It is just sounds terrible. I actually don't know if there's an aftermarket exhaust available for this vehicle that would sound good. Does anybody have a suggestion? Let me know in the comments. So for this model of Infiniti Q60 and G37, it came with either the availability of a 7-speed automatic transmission with little tiny paddle shifters on the steering wheel, very similar for the class, or the 6-speed manual transmission that you see here, which is a pretty good manual transmission. It's obviously the same one that you would see shared in the 370Z, and while it doesn't have that satisfying click from gear to gear, it isn't rubbery. So between the G37 sedan and the G37 coupe, which one do you think's heavier? Obviously, common sense would tell you the one with 2 doors more and 6 inches longer is probably going to be the heavier of the two. Wrong. The G37 sedan is actually outweighed by this porker of a coupe. Not by much, 3,675 pounds versus the coupe's 3,708 pounds. So you're only talking a difference of 33 pounds, but at the same time, how you lose 2 doors and 6 inches yet still gain weight is beyond me. Of the 3,708 pounds, 54% of that rests on the front half of the axle, with the other 46%, of course, on the rear. That actually surprised me when I saw that statistic, mostly because the Infiniti Q60 is more than happy to go drifting. There is not a hint of understeer in this vehicle. It wants to drift when you're going around curves, and it's a hell of a lot of fun. Let's talk the suspension. The suspension setup on the Infiniti is really excellent. It has just enough give that it does not roll over potholes and give you that jarring feeling like we had with the M4 competition. But as you can see through some of this video going around curves, it is tight. It does not give. This thing handles awesome. It really grips the curves, and I have to think it's the sport-tuned suspension as well as the tires that it's wearing. The Q60 came stock on 19s, wearing 225 up front, 245 in the rear, which is pretty thin tires. But actually I noticed something different with this car. Maybe somebody else got confused by the name as well, because this vehicle actually has the 20-inch Q60 new model rims on it, as well as 265/35 tire width all around, and there appears to be no rubbing or unusual wear. They absolutely plant, grip, and rip, but it's a ride that's very firm through the corners, and I think you'd enjoy the ride that you get through this. This is a good time to note that in addition to the Meteor tires and slightly larger rims, the Infiniti also has both of its dual intakes replaced with a K&N system. While not a huge performance difference, I usually like to find cars as close to stock for our test drives. Why? Because that's what you're most likely to encounter out there in real life. Highlight of this vehicle is definitely the brakes. These upgraded 14-inch rotors are awesome. 4-piston up front, 2-piston I believe in the back. It's a tight set of brakes, and it definitely improves the overall handling and cornering experience you get in the G. I like the Infiniti's interior a lot. Even 10 years later, it's clean. The aluminum trim instead of the fake maple wood trim is definitely an upgrade from the base model. I like the fact that everything's pretty simplistic. Nothing essential to this vehicle, from climate control to traction control or any kind of driving mode, is in here. It's all button oriented, even the heated seats. So you really have a car that is kind of old school, even if it's only 10 years ago. And with that being said, I like the touchscreen. It's very easy to get around, very easy to navigate. There's nothing too difficult or hidden in there. So for the Q60 in 2014, there were 4 different trims, really 3 common ones and 1 fairly rare odd one. The base level is the Q60 Journey, and it comes with some nice features like leather seats, but then you move up to the Q60 all-wheel drive. Self-explanatory is the next trim up. The third is actually the 6MT option. It's what Infiniti called the package if you ordered manual on this vehicle, and Infiniti did go out of their way to differentiate the 6MT model. Instead of 8-way power seats, you get 12-way power seats. Instead of 13-inch rotors, you get 14-inch rotors. There are all kind of soft touches like aluminum pedals and the aluminum trim available only on the 6MT model that Infiniti went out of their way to differentiate for this trim. And it's refreshing because also for the 6MT, they gave it a sportier suspension as well as a sportier steering feel. So it's really refreshing to see Infiniti went out of their way to differentiate all the way up until the very end the 6MT model. At the very top trim list was the IPL edition of the Q60s in 2014. IPL edition was a very rare, weird trim, and let me explain why. It popped up about halfway through the G37's lifetime, and I just don't really know who the audience is for that vehicle. It had 18 horsepower more than this vehicle does, but only 6 more pound-feet of torque, both fairly negligible amounts, though you would appreciate anything more. But it also didn't really have anything mechanically different. Same brakes, it had a little bit sportier of a suspension tune, but same suspension. It also had some aerodynamic upgrades that replaced the bumpers and side skirts that the internet and the Infiniti community as a whole has been pretty divided about since its beginning. Think of the competitors for the Q60 and G37s of its era. Think of the BMW 335. Well, its older brother is the BMW M3. Massive difference in performance. How about the Audi S5 and the Audi RS5? Again, massive differences in performance. Hell, even the Lexus IS350 and the Lexus ISF, monstrous differences in performance that you just don't see between the Q60s, this vehicle, and the IPL edition. So again, I just don't really know who that edition was built for. They're fairly rare. I've only seen a couple in my lifetime, and even though I would have been interested to test the power difference, they're pretty hard to get a hold of. Infiniti did eventually figure it out with the Red Sport edition on the next model that came after this, the 3.0 liter turbo. It was tuned to have 100 more horsepower than the edition right below it, so Infiniti found its value bargain a little bit better with the Red Sport than they did the IPL, and sure enough, that badge disappeared entirely. The Infiniti uses a Bose Studio on Wheels audio system that sounds amazing. It kicks ass, and you know, we've been on a good streak on this test drive channel of having cars with good audio systems, and I've said it before, I'll say it again, I think that's so important, especially in a daily driver, because whether you have a soundtrack out back or coming out your speakers, it's something to make your drive more exhilarating. One thing that I really do love about this car is that it does not have many driver assist or driver intervention technologies. Basically, all you have is traction control, rear sensors, and a rear camera. The steering wheel on the G37 is pretty thin. It's almost the opposite of the steering wheel that we saw on the S4, where everything was large, flat-bottomed, and contoured to your hand. This is almost like a drifter or tuner car. It's very Japanese, thin in your hands, probably pretty good for going around in a tight circle while the back wheels are spinning. It's a fine steering wheel, but nothing to write home about. I will say that if you are going to use the touchscreen, the fact that the controls are all the way up here instead of down here, probably because of the manual transmission, it is not a great reach. That's kind of a little bit further than tag's length away if you're sitting in decent posture, which I'm usually not. Also, decent headroom. If you're one of the passengers that draws the short straw and gets stuck in the back seat, I have some bad news for you. There is not much room. Even if you do manage to negotiate some legroom space with either the passenger or the driver, there is no neck room. At 6 foot here, I have to bend my neck sideways, and I don't even think if you were near 5'6" that you would fit in this. So these rear seats are really designed for children and children only. Otherwise, you're pretty much just as good going with a 370Z versus having this 2+2 seating, at least as far as passengers go. And the good news is nobody asks you for rides. When you look at the exterior styling of the Infiniti, it's super clean in my opinion. The classic HID lights give off a look that you just don't see anymore in LED headlights that are primarily featured in today's vehicles. The lines of the Infiniti are very smooth and roll without edges into the tight spoiler that fits right in. But there is an elephant in the room that we need to talk about. Even though this is the sister vehicle to the 370Z, I think it's more than arguable to say the Altima Coupe from Nissan actually looks much more similar to the Infiniti than the G37 looks to the 370Z. Take a look. Given that this is somewhat related to both the 370Z and the Nissan Altima, is it more Altima or more 370Z? Well, without a doubt, it is more 370Z than Altima Coupe. Really, they're not even the same car, whereas the 370Z and the Q60s are the same car, just with 2+2 seating versus 2 seating. For example, the Altima only got front wheel drive and the 2.5 liter V6. The 3.7 never showed up in it. Additionally, even while the lines may look similar, the actual setup of the Altima is different. You may have similar buttons inside. I promise there is a big mechanical difference between the Altima Coupe and the Q60s. Now, the 370Z and the Q60s are right there hand in hand. You know, another great question is, why would you pick this over the 370Z since they're essentially the same car? And I think it really comes down to two things. This is a little bit more spacious. Obviously, the 370Z is a roadster, and you do have a few more luxury treatments on this. 370Z will not come with a sunroof, so it really is the same exact car in 99.9%. So let's talk about the elephant in the room that we hit at the very top. Is this the Infiniti G37s or the Q60s? Yes. Look, it all is one man's fault. Johan de Nischen, and I don't know if I'm saying that right, but he was the CEO of Infiniti from 2012 to 2014. Johan was brought in to bring up lagging sales. Johan came in and said, basically, to fix all the lagging sales in Infiniti, we need one thing. People are confused by the excellent names that we have. We need to change it all to one letter. And that is how this became the Q60, and everything else in the Infiniti lineup had a Q attached to it. Now, did it solve Infiniti's sales problem? No, absolutely not. It was a dumb idea. Matter of fact, Johan left Infiniti to go to Cadillac the very same year that they rolled out the Q letter badging. Now, thankfully, Johan was fired from Cadillac before he could do too much damage to all the hollowed name brands over there. So what are some of the highlights? The first highlight sits right underneath this hood. It's the 3.7 liter V6 that powers this Infiniti G37, and it's just excellent. It's almost more playful than most engines. As opposed to the S4, which was just a unit, this thing rewards you when you go all the way through the tachometer. It wants you to hit redline every time, and it's a very rewarding feeling rowing your own gears with this V6 powering it. Another highlight of the G37s is without a doubt the handling. Now, I know this is riding on meatier tires and a little bit bigger rims, but the sport tune suspension that comes on the 6MT model is just fantastic. Like I said, you never experience any kind of understeer with this car, and it's just a blast handling on these mountain roads. Another highlight, I've got to say, is the really clean tech stack in this thing. You'll recall with the Audi, I was not a very big fan of its tech stack, and same with the Ferrari, but this is actually one of the nicer infotainment centers, certainly of its era, and it continues to be useful with its touchscreen features today. 7 inches for its infotainment is a little small, but it's going to get everything you need for this type of car. I've also got to say, from a highlight perspective, even though this does draw some criticism with shared lines with the Nissan Altima, I really do think this is a really sleek, good-looking car. When you take a look at just how the curves bend into each other.
So what are some of the negatives of the Infiniti Q60s?
Our negatives start the same place our positives started, and it's right underneath this hood. Look, the naturally aspirated 3.7 liter V6 does an admirable job generating horsepower, 330, but it lags on torque. It's very lean, and you can feel it on your 0 to 60 runs. Just look, for instance, how it is half a second behind the Audi S4 from 0 to 60, coming in at 5.4 seconds versus the Audi's 4.9. But when you look at the quarter mile, it maintains that gap as the horsepower starts to kick in, finishing only half a second behind the Audi S4 in the quarter mile. So what's that tell you? It tells you that we're very lean on torque to start with before the horsepower can really keep you going.
We are just below 10,000 feet, and the Infiniti is definitely paying for it. Look, I probably did not put this in the greatest situation for test drive. Honestly, the handling is a great test in the mountains, but the higher up you get, the thinner the air is for naturally aspirated engines. The rule of thumb is that you lose 3% of horsepower for every 1,000 feet you go up. Well, that's around 30% loss of horsepower, which means on the 330 horsepower engine, you're looking at around 100 horsepower. This Infiniti doesn't have 100 horsepower to give. So again, I don't really think I've been completely fair, at least on some of the engine and performance testing up here, because I put the Infiniti in a bad testing environment. or at least an environment that's not exactly conducive to high performance. As far as testing how this car handles, I can't think of a better place. Another negative, and this isn't really the Infiniti's fault, but it looks dangerously similar to an Ultima Coupe. Now, I know the Ultima Coupe came after the Infiniti, so maybe they designed it based off of the G37s, but when you look at some of the angles and lines, there is a lot of dangerous similarity there. It really is akin to what I think of as the Toyota MR2 and the Porsche Boxster fiasco of the early 2000s, where it was just a blatant copy. At least with these two companies, they're related. Another negative, and it kind of defeats the purpose of the Infiniti, is just how cramped and small the back seats are. I guess they're good for children, but let's make no mistake, this is a car of more wide income than the Porsche 911, the Jaguar XKR, the Ferrari California. Like, this is more likely to be a daily driver, and you may fit children in there, but you're not fitting your colleagues if you go out to lunch, or your friends if you go out to dinner, unless they're going to be rather short people. At the beginning of this test drive, we set out to answer one question. Given that the 2014 Audi S4 that we just test drove is an excellent competitor within this segment, could the Infiniti Q60s compete with the Audi S4 or even beat it? My answer is maybe. It depends on what type of car you're looking for. I think it honestly comes down to the driving experience you want. I would say if you're at a track and trying to set a serious time, the Audi S4 is going to be your car between these two. But if you're at the track with friends or even just driving around normal, I would say this is by far the more playful, fun car to drive around. It has one of the sportier setups of a naturally aspirated V6. Think about it, manual transmission, rear-wheel drive setup, 330 horsepower V6, and very few, if any, driver intervention features. Face it, this is a drift-happy luxury coupe. I would actually say this is one of the more fun cars of that era, and it may not hold up on the track to the Audi S4, but I think you'll have a lot more fun in this car. I do want to say, I think this is the last great G37s. I know the turbocharged editions have come along, but this was, of course, the last manual transmission. And also, when the next generation came out, it did gain some torque going from 270 to 295, but it lost 30 horsepower going from 330 down to 300 in the stock trim. So this was actually a more powerful, at least on horsepower, engine than the one that came after it. So what do you all think? What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Would you enjoy having the Infiniti G37s or Q60s, depending on what year you get, as your daily driver? Thank you for joining Test Drive Infiniti Q60s or G37s. At this point, it's really your choice. This was the fourth in our test drive series of videos. As I've mentioned before, the whole purpose of these test drive series of videos is to get our hands on awesome internal combustion engines while they're still around. After all, as time goes on, automakers are going to comply more and more with mileage requirements by building more EVs and less awesome internal combustion engines. After all, the 3.7 liter V6 that powers this Q60s is already dead. So if you enjoy these test drive videos, hit subscribe if you'd like to continue seeing them. We're going to keep doing these and trying to get our hands on more and more cool cars. I would love to know which cars you would like to see test drove on this channel. We've gotten a lot of really great recommendations that actually have in the works, hopefully, for later test drives on this channel. And if you did enjoy this video, it would mean the world to me if you hit like or told a friend.
As always, thanks for watching. I'm Alex, your host, and I'll see you on the next test drive.